My name is Brandon Matherson. I am with Microsoft. I'm in what's called the Cloud Platform team at Microsoft. Our focus is really on the core data center technologies and thinking about cloud investments. So brands you might be familiar with are Windows Server, System Center, Windows Azure Pack, Microsoft Azure. Also thinking about how our workloads lay on top of that when we think about first-party workloads with Office, Exchange, SharePoint, Link, Exchange, Link, SharePoint. No, I'm missing one other, SQL. And then also thinking about our heterogeneous support with Linux, and Linux sitting on top of our platform as well. That's a big investment area for us as well. So I'll kind of just talk through kind of our vision for what the cloud means and how we're investing in those technologies. But to help me better understand kind of the audience here and what you guys are doing, are many of you invested or are familiar or have any Windows Server or Hyper-V in your environments today? Are familiar with it? Okay. All right. Many of you thinking about deploying or delivering services in a cloud fashion or consuming cloud, much less? Okay. Okay. All right. So I'll kind of talk through some things. I will be around just for a few minutes afterwards. I'll be around for just a few minutes afterwards. And I can kind of, if you have some questions or about some specific things that I'm talking about, I'll just be a bit more general here today. Let's see. Yeah. I think I can figure it out. I did it. All right. So one of the things I'll be pivoting on today is really thinking about this notion of what's called the Cloud OS. This is not necessarily a product. It's not something we sell. It is our strategy and how we're going to be delivering cloud services in our current set of products with 2012 R2 and beyond. And it pivots around 5 core areas. That's transforming the data center. And that's about our core investment in on-premises data center and investments in Azure and investments in service provider environments. And if you look on the left, that's essentially what we'll be pivoting on consistently throughout our stack. So let me back up. When I say cloud, I'm not talking about place. The notion of cloud is not a place. It is an architecture. And we're delivering that across on-premises and a private cloud scenario, private cloud, public cloud with Microsoft Azure, and then service provider. The second one is we're going to unlock insights on any data. That's our commitment and our investments around our SQL platform and the database platform and BI and intelligence, analytics, things like that. We're then going to be paying attention quite a bit to enterprise mobility. Formerly, you may have thought of this as people-centric IT. But this is the notion of delivering, I heard a couple of other gentlemen talking about this, is delivering, enabling IT to bring in your own devices. Be able to think about identity for those users, the end user perspective, what applications do they have access to, what are their security and permissions and things like that. Technologies that are going to live in that space are going to definitely be around Active Directory, System Center Configuration Manager, as well as Intune and managing devices from that perspective. We're then thinking about modern applications. We understand that as cloud consumption comes into play more and more, how enterprises consume data through applications is much different. Apps are now multi-tiered and span environments, span premises, as well as whether they be with the service provider, the Azure, so forth and so on. Then the last thing is Internet of Things. This is the idea of bringing all these different perspectives of the other 4 pillars together to deliver apps that build on analytics and drive data and that learn on demand. When you think about things that they're doing with machine learning and Azure and things like that, could also fall in this space as well. So these are the core areas that we're going to be investing in. I specifically sit in transforming the data center and core Windows Server System Center capabilities. But when you think about how we're going to be coming to market, it will be with the notion of delivering across all these environments. It's not an either or, it is an and statement for us. Okay? And so we know that people are starting to consume cloud. As I just saw, hey, there's not as many customers that are readily adopting cloud services today, whether that be Azure, whether that be on-prem. We know that it's part of the strategy moving forward, and we know that it needs to be, we have to think about speed and performance. So investments that we're making in ensuring that our Windows Server stack at the core is proficient, it is high performant, gives high performance, and can then scale as well. And then cost is another core piece of the whole position as well, and thinking about cost from the perspective of hardware in relation to how we're actually going to be able to consume services and spin up what we used to deliver on-prem in the form of services. So these are the types of scenarios that I'll be speaking to today. The first part that I'll kind of talk through is what our approach is when I think about standardizing on our stack with Windows Server and primarily System Center. And then we'll talk about how are we going to automate some things, automating data center tasks, what IT admins do today in terms of provisioning services, spinning up VM clouds, things like that. But how can we start to automate those things and then take back more time and resources for other things? And then we want to talk about how we're going to start to scale out and then perform in that environment. So from an architecture perspective, or more from an overview perspective, we see the location of things, to be at the bottom. As early as, maybe a year ago, you might have seen this flip. We always think about infrastructure first at the very bottom and then everything else. Well, we see the infrastructure can be anywhere. And that's what we're building towards. Azure is built on Windows Server Hyper-V. That is the core in our data centers. That's the same thing we're delivering to customers today in on-premises data centers. Okay? So whether it's on-prem, whether it's Microsoft Azure, or a multitude of service providers that you have, we can deliver the core infrastructure stack. And core infrastructure being compute, networking, and storage are now being inbuilt within Windows Server, introduced with 2012 R2. Okay? We're seeing System Center is where the management suite comes from. And that's where we start to manage all the different functions that you're familiar with in the stack, whether it be virtual machine manager, where you can start to manage clouds and manage provisioning of storage, provisioning of your virtual networks are now done in virtual machine manager. You're doing monitoring within operations manager in 2012 R2. We're able to monitor both on-premises infrastructure and then thinking about monitoring through management packs what other services or what other systems are spun up in other public cloud offerings, okay, or service provider offerings. And then Service Manager is where you're going to see a lot of the ITSM capabilities come into play. So when you're thinking about scenarios for yourself and or your customers, where you want to think about policies and think about how you're going to be providing governance and things of that nature, Service Manager is where those capabilities are still going to live, and being able to build on core data center service catalog type items, problem management, incident management, and things like that. And then layering on top of this, or excuse me, as a part of the solution to automate those things is where Microsoft System Center Orchestrator comes into play. And Orchestrator is an automation engine. I want to call that the engine for how we're going to think about automation moving forward. Okay. So let me kind of just another pivot on this. I wanted to just provide more context for how we see this. Is that we're delivering what's really synonymous in the market around software-defined infrastructure, software-defined compute, storage, networking, or things that we're delivering now in Windows Server. And investments there are definitely around how we're managing both the hosts and the guests to deliver a more software-defined approach to policies that are, when we think about in the storage, with our storage spaces and things of that nature. We're thinking about network virtualization, and Hyper-V is really, really key for us, and being able to provide those services on commodity hardware. And that's things that we're really staying focused on. And that's the fabric management. That's core infrastructure, regardless of location. Now, layering on top of this, where we now start to think about that next step. I'm believing, and I could be wrong, I'm believing a lot of folks in here have really taken a step and have really progressed in the way of virtualization. We've gotten to the point where we're virtualized. We're starting to consolidate our servers and things of that nature. It's perfectly understandable. Now let's start delivering some services, and that's what we're starting to think about. What are those services? We're delivering a service catalog, tenant plans, billing and chargeback, as well as change management. On premises, this is what's done in Service Manager for customers that are delivering private cloud scenarios, delivering this in with Service Manager and Virtual Machine Manager, and then Windows Azure Pack sitting on top of that. That's on premises. And for those who are not familiar with it, Windows Azure Pack is not public Azure. It is bringing everything invested in Microsoft Azure in the cloud that you get from a public consumption coming on premises built on top of Windows Server and System Center. Okay? The same exact experience. Of course, the plans and the gallery items and things like that may be different, but now you're delivering each of those items to your customers internally, whether they be internal tenants or external customers, being delivered on premises inside of your own personal data center. And even if the data center spans multiple locations, that's fine. But that's what the Windows Azure Pack does. So that's where you're going to see, hey, I want to think about, I spin up certain services for my marketing department versus certain services for my development teams. That's perfectly fine, and those can be identified based on users. You can spin up variances of virtual machine roles to define, hey, here are the hardware profiles and various services that need to be consumed for a particular usage. All on shared infrastructure at the very bottom. Shared compute, networking, and storage. Okay? Then you're thinking about billing and chargeback. That's also a big area where we're investing in quite a bit to provide IT with the ability to have insight into what is being consumed. In an on-premises world, this is very important because we're continuing to absorb and consume resources and spin up new hardware. We need to gain that hardware back. And that's why we're investing in this so heavily. Did someone have a question? Okay. And then change management is the other, being able to manage change and things of that nature. Okay. At the very top is where you'll see our tenant services, and we'll spin up things like high-density websites in Microsoft Azure Public Cloud or on-premises with Windows Azure Pack. Okay. We're going to spin up virtual machines. We're going to pay heavy attention to service bus. We're going to look at database as a service and things like that. Okay. So as you start thinking about how you build applications, this is how we envision the stack being built and what we're working towards within Windows Server, System Center, and Windows Azure Pack. And these are big areas for us. Okay. Outside of everything, of all of this, we say, hey, you have your data center in place, and then we start to think about consumption and usage of services where you may not have resources on-prem, is where we think about business continuity and disaster recovery. Okay. This is the area where we're saying, hey, we need to ensure that these services that you've built are always up and running. When we think about the workloads, your end users, your tenants, they're accessing some type of application. It could be a SQL application, it could be a website, it can be something or some proprietary application that you've built up. We need to make sure that it's always up, that it's always available. And so we're making investments in areas that I'll talk about in some of the later slides. Okay. So as I mentioned, in the software-defined data center, we took a shift from thinking about just consumption of per server, per service, per application, to consolidating that and standardizing how those infrastructures get built. And that silo can be, hey, there's a storage team, there's a networking team, there's an app dev team, there's a service admin team. You know, these variants of teams that are now able to consume some of the same types of benefits built in Server 2012 R2 and beyond, directly from that storage-defined approach that we're building towards. Okay. So when we think about compute, is where we're really paying attention, and I'll pivot quite a bit on our approach to managing and scaling out with virtual machines and managing virtual machines within Hyper-V. And this is the very first step that we've taken, that we've been able to expand our scale and capacity for VMs in R2. We've been able to also think about scenarios where the guests are not just, and we hear this quite a bit, Microsoft, do you support Linux? Microsoft, do you support a variance of other technologies. And these are things that we're doing and that we're committed to quite a bit. Open source integration is really, really huge for us. So we're also doing things, investments to increase performance in VM mobility. So thinking about things like live migration, storage live migration as well, and then being able to think about compression and things like that to increase speed and performance. Those are things that are going to enable you to think about the application, ensure that it's up, and then move those services as you need to across environments. Why is this important moving forward, and what do we see this being key to? Because we understand that services need to be scaled up and scaled down based on time and cost. So over time, you say, hey, it's cheaper for me to keep resources on-prem at a given time versus when do I need to have that at my service provider? Or what portions of my applications can live in various places, because no longer is the application one thing anymore. We know there are quite a bit. A majority may be today, but we know the direction that cloud consumption and the cloud services are headed, or those applications are multi-tiered. Pieces of that application live all over the place. The database tier is at my desk. The web front end is someplace else. I have another portion of the application that lives over at my service provider. We understand that, and we need to make sure that we're thinking about that. So VM mobility and scale matter quite a bit when we start to think about consumption of those services. Clustering is also a big focus area as well, thinking about how we actually increase performance in our clusters and also think about transition or migration, or shall I say upgrading, as you move across our platforms between 2012 or the 2012 R2, or even if you're on 2008 R2, et cetera. So that's what we're thinking about, is how we're updating those clusters as well. That's something that we're bringing in quite a bit. Okay. From a networking perspective, the same approach, very similar to what we saw when we were thinking about compute, or when we're thinking about storage. Per application or per server, we have a network, or we have a specific IP for that particular device or that particular service that's being delivered. That's what we've seen moving forward. In 2012 R2, we thought about network virtualization, being able to share network infrastructure while siloing off variants of teams. I saw a number of folks here speaking about what SDN is, so I won't dive too much into that, but that's what we're delivering in the concept and the idea of what 2012 R2 is going to be delivering, as well as future investments in this space. Okay, is ensuring that you're able to take advantage of your infrastructure, your investments in hardware today, and provide that level of flexibility. Because why is this important in a cloud world? Is because what we're seeing is that organizations are doing a couple of things. There's consolidation or acquisitions. They're bringing teams and organizations together that may have appeared to exist in the same network in their own various environments. When they come under your one umbrella, you now can deliver that same experience on the same environment while still having siloed protection across those different groups. Okay. This is the same thing that you're actually going to be delivering in Microsoft Azure, and we see the service provider scenarios where you have your particular service providers as locations as well, or as separate entities that can be brought into this strategy too. From a piece that I'll talk about with storage is that we hear quite a bit, oh, Microsoft, you're doing software-defined storage, or you're doing things in investments in the storage. What does this mean for my current investments in SAN and things like that? We are definitely enabling customers to take advantage of those investments they already have and think about consuming things around services like storage spaces. We have a number of vendors who are certified in that space as well, that I can share with folks as well. We have folks that are certified to deliver storage spaces and be able to deliver across a number of different platforms. Also doing the same thing when we think about scale out file server improvements that we've made as well, and then thinking about data duplication is something that we're also delivering quite significantly, and improvements are being made there. So this is inherently built into Windows Server as well as managed in System Center. So automation, I did talk about automation for a moment. We think about it in a number of different fashions. You're going to provision services. You're going to provision virtual hardware and virtual machines and things of that nature. We need to deploy them across a variant of locations. We need to make sure that we monitor them appropriately, and then we're going to make sure that they are up to snuff based on what we think the ideal performance of that app should be. Automation is the key to doing all of this, and we have a technology called Service Management Automation, which is our latest version, our latest iteration on what automation really is. You saw this in Orchestrator. For folks, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with System Center Orchestrator, which is our current solution that's in the market today. Service Management Automation is built on PowerShell. 100% PowerShell. Moving forward, our investment area is PowerShell. Okay. So as we think about, hey, what do I need to do to think about automation, or where should I do automation? That's PowerShell. It's surfaced in Orchestrator as well as SMA. As well as Windows Azure Pack, I'm sorry. Okay. So when you're inside of Windows Azure Pack, you can take advantage of a lot of the runbooks. And that's what it's called in Orchestrator, is runbooks, which are essentially a graphical authoring tool for every step that needs to take place in the environment. Hey, I have a machine, I have a host that's reaching capacity. It can tell it to go spin off an alert to go to Service Manager, for instance, and then automatically take some action. Hey, I need to add more capacity, or I need to add another virtual disk. I can add more capacity to my storage space. Okay? I can then add those services into my environment and then still have the service up and running without the users having any downtime notice. That's the type of things that we're thinking about, but doing that also in cloud delivering of services. Okay? So when you're inside of Windows Azure Pack, which is on-prem, you're doing that same thing, but you can also, we have extensions out to Azure as well. So you can kick off commands for activities that are going to happen in the public cloud with Microsoft Azure. Okay. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to monitor, and you can automate how you monitor things, and that's definitely the connection that we have with Operations Manager. And then a big tool that we have as well is thinking about Advisor. System Center Advisor, which is taking all the learnings and garnering all the learnings that we've gotten from our support organization and customer service and support, and delivering that to customers so that you can see, is my application configured appropriately? I think it's working, but it perhaps isn't performing like they say it should. That's where that comes into play. Okay. From a provisioning perspective, it's all about templating. If you're familiar with VM templates and Windows Azure Pack, we're thinking about what's called VM roles. And that is the idea essentially of, when I build out an application, I need to make sure I deploy it the same way every time. So I have a set of services that I'm going to predefine in terms of virtual hardware. I identify which virtual NICs I need to be using. I identify what OS I need to be using, or am I going to allow my users to pick some of those components? You can do that as well, but that's all in a template and a blueprint that gets deployed. So every time that request comes in from a self-service perspective, they can spin it up. Okay, and it provisions and deploys that service the same way every time. Okay, and again, it gets delivered. It can be delivered across any of those platforms that we're talking about. Okay. And so we're delivering that across our on-premises. Definitely, you can deliver it on your private cloud scenario, as well as out to Azure, and then scenarios where service providers make sense. Okay. All right. So from a service delivery perspective, this is a big focus area for us as well, because we know this is what really impacts what users and end users and or end customers. If you're a service provider and you have end customers, is where we're going to start to think about self-service experiences. So again, and you'll hear me keep saying this, when we step into the Windows Azure Pack is where you're going to see that dual experience. If you're an IT admin or a service admin, where you're actually provisioning all of the service catalog items. And we're going to call these, instead of service catalog, let's call them plans or gallery items. That's going to be consistent with what you get in Microsoft Azure when you think about Microsoft Azure infrastructure as a service. Okay? And then you're going to be able to deploy any of those activities as an admin, but your users also go to the same experience. Let's call it another window or another side of that experience is what they can actually request, and it's unique per user, per group, etc. And you can identify in a private cloud environment what is the cost of this as well. So you're able to track how much does this cost, what resource do I need to ask back, things like that. So then a lot of this was internal, or let me say private cloud environment. Now thinking purely just in public cloud with Microsoft Azure, here's an idea of just the number of locations that we're in today, where we're delivering Microsoft Azure data centers, and again built on our stack that we actually sell for enterprise customers. It just gives you a perspective of where we are and what we're delivering. One of the things for folks that do have relationship with your sales team or folks in your organization, I do encourage you to go out and take a look at the Azure Data Center, make a visit there, and get a sense of how we're actually delivering services and delivering resources from those locations. Security is a big one that we're continuing to get questions on. One from a software perspective, and one from a physical perspective. From a software perspective, it's investments that we're making in our stack around, one, securing the host as well as the guests. Okay, as well as the guests, and those two, and that's something that we see as and starting to decouple that notion that it may not be all the same at one time. But yet, as we think about how do users or folks that are using applications need to have access to the VM, what changes they need to be able to make, what does this impact the host? And I need to make sure that I'm alerted, and we're building in scenarios where alerts and awareness are coming into play for IT admins as they think about any potential issues or concerns with integrity in the environment. Privacy and compliance are always key as well. From a physical perspective, within our Azure data centers, we do recommend, why I do recommend folks go there is really understand how we're actually protecting physical hardware that's actually delivered in our data centers for customers. Okay? It gives you a sense of where I thought there might be some integrity concerns. It is truly a secure environment. Okay? All right. So when I think about delivering these capabilities in a hybrid scenario, and hybrid meaning just across a number of premises, whether it's your service provider and just public Azure, or service provider and your on-premises world, we're thinking about all these variants of scenarios. And the one that I want to call out here is hybrid identity. This is a big area for us, and that's mostly associated with enterprise mobility. Why is this so important, and why do people care? And the thing is that we're investing so heavily in ensuring that IT admins can enable BYOD scenarios. We're making sure that they can enable access and protection of physical IP or virtual IP from the organization. Because now users can bring in a multitude of devices, whether it be an iPad, whether it be a Surface, whether it be a Nexus, whether it be any of the devices that exist in the world. Users are going to come into the environment with those devices. And now we're enabling technologies or solutions like remote applications, remote app in Azure, to manage, to take Active Directory and define what a user has access to on their local device for corporate applications that are not physically loaded on the device. So the user doesn't have those applications there, but yet I can control as an IT admin what they get access to, and they can still be productive in their personal environment, even outside of the office. So that's one that's really big that we're really paying a lot of attention to, because that impacts how productive customers are today. Okay. Storage, from a hybrid cloud storage perspective, this is also we're taking advantage of Azure services. If you're familiar with StorSimple, or we're taking the idea, hey, when we're running out of capacity on premises, but yet we want to take advantage of additional storage that exists in Azure, and StorSimple helps us do that. We're able to then think about, hey, I can consume Azure where it makes sense. I can move cold data out to Azure as you need to, and define, hey, I'm only leveraging or accessing what's most important, what's most relevant for me, while still maintaining control in my environment in terms of capacity. From the business continuity perspective, another Azure service, Azure-related services, and again, it's the notion, all these things are the notion of taking advantage of investments on-prem while still also consuming some cloud. So we're thinking about Azure Site Recovery, formerly as Hyper-V Recovery Manager. This is Azure Site Recovery, where before I could recover from site to site, on-prem or through a number of locations, my data center locations. Now Azure is a target. It used to be just a control plane. It's now a target. So now I can recover to Azure. Our latest acquisition with InMaj gave us the ability to start thinking about, now I can think about the application or the VM and ensure that I'm backing up and I'm thinking about a DR scenario for that app or for that workload. Let me call that workload. Okay? And that's the thing that was big for us as well. And that we're continuing to think about the same notion of Azure being a recovery location. Okay? So these are the types of things that we're doing at Microsoft. I know it's kind of short, but I'll be around at least for a little while. And if you need to ask questions, I do need to take off relatively quick. But if there's something that's burning, I can answer some questions in the back. So I hope that's helpful, and I look forward to hearing from any of you if you have questions.